My parents banned me from dating after my sister's abusive ex, but they don't know I'm getting married tomorrow. My parents established exactly one rule after what happened to my sister, Violet. No dating, no relationships, no romantic involvement of any kind until I turned 25, or they'd cut off all financial support and I'd be on my own. They didn't make this rule because they were controlling or religious. They made it because they'd watched Violet's boyfriend, Derek, systematically destroy her over 3 years, isolating her from friends, convincing her she was worthless, and finally putting her in the hospital with a fractured skull when she tried to leave. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. She was 22 when it started, the same age I am now. My parents couldn't protect Violet because they didn't see the signs until it was too late. So, they decided to protect me by eliminating the possibility entirely. No dating meant no chance of choosing wrong. Simple math in their traumatized minds. The problem was that I'd already met Asher 6 months before they implemented the rule. We were lab partners in organic chemistry, and he had this way of explaining complex molecules like he was telling stories about tiny characters going on adventures. He made me laugh during the most stressful semester of my pre-med track. And somewhere between bonding over failed titrations and celebrating our first successful synthesis, I'd fallen completely in love with him. When my parents announced the new rule 3 weeks after Violet got out of the hospital, Asher and I had already been secretly dating for 2 months. I went home that night and cried in his apartment, convinced we'd have to break up because I couldn't survive without my parents' help paying for medical school. Asher held me and said we'd figure it out together, that 3 years wasn't forever, and he'd wait as long as it took. We became experts at hiding in plain sight. Asher was my study partner, my tutoring buddy, the friend who happened to live near campus, so I could stay late at the library without my parents worrying. We studied at coffee shops where we sat across from each other with textbooks open, holding hands under the table where nobody could see. We celebrated anniversaries in his apartment with takeout and quiet music, always careful that I left early enough to maintain my story. My roommate, Priya, knew the truth and covered for me constantly, texting my parents updates about our girls' nights when I was actually curled up on Asher's couch watching medical dramas and critiquing their terrible depictions of hospital procedures. For 2 years, we lived in this careful balance of secret relationship and public friendship. And somehow, it worked because my parents were so focused on Violet's recovery that they didn't look too closely at my life. Violet knew, though. She figured it out about 8 months in when she came to visit me at school and saw the way Asher and I looked at each other in the campus center. She pulled me aside later and asked point blank if we were together, and I couldn't lie to her. I expected her to be angry or to tell her parents, but instead, she hugged me and said she was glad I'd found someone who made me smile like that. She made me promise to be careful and to actually listen if anyone told me they saw red flags because she hadn't listened and it nearly killed her. I promised, and she became our secret keeper, the only family member who knew the truth. She'd cover for me when I needed alibis and would text warnings if our parents were asking too many questions about my social life. She said watching Asher and me gave her hope that healthy love actually existed. That not every relationship ended in broken bones and restraining orders. Everything changed 6 months ago when Asher proposed. We were hiking up to this waterfall he'd been promising to show me for months. And when we reached the top, he got down on one knee with a ring he'd been saving for since our first anniversary. He said he knew he couldn't tell anyone and couldn't actually get married until my parents' arbitrary timeline expired. But he wanted me to know he was committed to waiting however long it took. I said yes while crying so hard I could barely see the ring. The simple silver band with a tiny sapphire that he'd chosen because he knew I'd need something I could hide. I wore it on a chain under my shirt where my parents would never see it. And we started calling each other fiancé in private even though publicly we maintained the study buddy fiction. We told ourselves we'd make it official when I turned 25 in 3 years, that we'd have a small ceremony and finally stop hiding. Then Violet got sick. She started having headaches that wouldn't go away. And after weeks of doctors and tests, they found a brain tumor the size of a golf ball pressing against her frontal lobe. The neurosurgeon said it was likely benign, but needed to come out immediately before it caused permanent damage. The surgery was scheduled for 8 weeks out, and my parents completely fell apart. They had just gotten Violet back after losing her to Derek's control, and now they might lose her permanently to something growing inside her skull. I spent every evening at the hospital with them during Violet's pre-surgery appointments. And one night, after a particularly hard consultation, Violet pulled me into the hallway alone. She told me she'd updated her, well, just in case. And one of her wishes was that if something happened to her during surgery, she wanted me to stop hiding and actually live my life. She wanted me to marry Asher and be happy instead of waiting for some arbitrary deadline our traumatized parents had invented. I told her nothing was going to happen, that the surgeon had said the success rate was like 97%. But she grabbed my hand hard and made me promise anyway. She said she'd spent 3 years of her life trapped with someone who made her miserable. And she wasn't going to let me waste 3 more years hiding someone who made me happy. I promised, even though the idea of her not being okay made me feel sick. The surgery was scheduled for a Monday morning in November, and they said she'd be in recovery for about 6 hours before we could see her. My parents took time off work and basically moved into the hospital waiting room. Asher came with me and sat in the corner pretending to study while actually just being there for support. When the surgeon finally came out after 7 hours instead of 6, we all stood up so fast we nearly knocked over chairs. He said the tumor had been more complicated than the scans showed, wrapped around blood vessels in ways that made removal difficult. But they'd gotten it all, and Violet was stable. She woke up confused and nauseous, but she woke up. Over the next 2 weeks, she recovered faster than anyone expected, already walking the halls and complaining about hospital food by day 4. The pathology came back benign like they'd hoped, and the surgeon said she wouldn't need radiation or chemo, just monitoring to make sure nothing grew back. My parents cried with relief and probably thanked every deity they'd ever heard of. The night before Violet was discharged, she asked to talk to me alone. I thought she wanted to discuss post-surgery care or something practical, but instead, she asked if I remembered my promise. I said, of course, but she was fine now, so there was no reason to rush anything. She shook her head and said going through this had taught her that life was too short and too unpredictable to waste time waiting for perfect circumstances. She told me to marry Asher now, not in 3 years, and she'd help me figure out how to tell our parents afterward. I went home that night and told Asher what Violet said, and we stayed up until 3 o'clock in the morning talking about whether we were actually brave enough to do it. We'd been playing it safe for so long that the idea of actively defying my parents felt terrifying and wrong. But we also couldn't ignore that Violet was right, that we'd already wasted 2 years hiding and 3 more years felt like an eternity when we were already sure about each other. Asher said if I was willing to risk my parents' reaction, he'd marry me tomorrow. I said, let's do it next month instead. Give ourselves time to plan something small and figure out how to break the news. We decided on a courthouse ceremony with just a few close friends. Nothing fancy, just legal and real and ours. We set the date for January 14th, exactly 8 weeks away, and started making quiet preparations that my parents would never notice. Priya helped me shop for a dress during winter break. Something simple and cream-colored that I could wear again so it wouldn't be suspicious sitting in my closet. Asher's best friend, Lucas, agreed to be our witness, and Violet said she'd be there even if she had to sneak out of a follow-up appointment to make it. We didn't send invitations or book a venue because we didn't want any trail my parents might discover. We just needed the marriage license and 2 witnesses and an officiant who'd perform a 5-minute ceremony at the courthouse downtown. It felt simultaneously like the most important decision of my life, and also somehow too simple to be real. My roommate asked if I was scared about my parents cutting me off financially, and honestly, I was terrified. Medical school was expensive, and I'd already taken out loans for part of my tuition. Losing their help would mean more debt and possibly having to take time off to work, pushing back my graduation. But Asher had already graduated with his engineering degree and had a good job at a tech company downtown. He'd been saving money specifically for the possibility that we'd need to support ourselves if my parents reacted badly. He showed me his bank account one night to prove he was serious, that we could actually survive this. He'd calculated our budget, assuming I'd lose all parental support. And while it would be tight and we'd have to be careful, it was doable. I cried looking at those spreadsheets because they represented 2 years of him planning for our future when most people our age were still figuring out what they wanted for dinner. We told ourselves that maybe my parents would surprise us, that maybe seeing me happy would matter more than their fear-based rule. But we prepared for the worst-case scenario anyway. The hardest part was lying to my parents every single day leading up to the wedding. They'd call to check in and ask about my classes and my studying, and I'd tell them everything was fine while wearing my hidden engagement ring under my shirt. My mom would talk about Violet's recovery and how grateful she was that our family was finally healing, completely unaware that I was about to detonate their peace. I felt guilty constantly knowing that what I was doing would hurt them, even though I believed it was right. Violet kept telling me the guilt would fade once I was actually married and happy. That our parents' fears didn't get to control my entire life. She'd been through actual hell with Derek and survived. And she said my healthy relationship with Asher deserved to exist in the light instead of hiding in shadows. She helped me practice what I'd say when I finally told them, going through different scenarios and responses until I had something prepared for every possible reaction. 2 weeks before the wedding, Derek got out on parole. Violet got a notification from the victim services coordinator, and she'd called me immediately, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand her. He'd served only 3 years of his 8-year sentence because of prison overcrowding and good behavior. And now he was out with an ankle monitor and a restraining order that Violet said was just a piece of paper. My parents went into full protection mode again, installing new locks and security cameras and basically putting Violet under house arrest for her own safety. The restraining order said Derek couldn't come within 500 feet of her, but they didn't trust it. They had trusted the legal system before, and it had failed her. This development obviously made my situation more complicated, because now my parents were extra paranoid about anything that could hurt their daughters. I thought about postponing the wedding, but Violet said absolutely not. She said Derek getting out was exactly why I needed to go through with it. To prove that his actions didn't get to control everything in our family forever. She pointed out that my relationship with Asher had nothing to do with her trauma with Derek, and conflating the two was exactly the problem with our parents' blanket ban on dating. Not every man was Derek. Not every relationship ended in violence. I deserved my own story separate from hers. She promised she'd be at the courthouse on January 14th, even if our parents had her on lockdown, that she'd figure out a way to be there for me like I'd been there for her through the surgery. The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in my dorm room staring at the ceiling while Priya slept peacefully in the next bed, and I went through every possible outcome in my mind. Best case, my parents were hurt, but eventually came around. Worst case, they cut me off completely, and I didn't see them again for years. The morning of January 14th arrived cold and bright, and I woke up at 6 o'clock, even though the ceremony wasn't until 11 o'clock. Priya made me eat breakfast, even though my stomach was in knots. And she helped me get ready like we were preparing for battle. I put on the cream dress and simple makeup, and the ring that had been hiding under my shirt for 6 months. Priya took photos of me in our dorm room. These pictures I'd show my future children someday when they asked about my wedding day. Asher texted at 9:30 saying he was already at the courthouse with Lucas, and the officiant was ready whenever we were. I told Priya it was time to go, and we walked out into the freezing January air toward downtown. My phone rang when we were 2 blocks away, and I nearly dropped it when I saw it was my mom calling. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely answer, and Priya grabbed my arm to steady me. My mom's voice was tight, with barely controlled panic. She asked where I was because she'd called my dorm room, and I didn't answer. I said I was out getting coffee with Priya before my afternoon class, which was a lie since it was only 10 o'clock in the morning, and I didn't have class on Thursdays. She said she needed me to come home right now because something had happened with Violet. My heart stopped completely, and I asked if Violet was okay, if Derek had violated the restraining order, if she was hurt. My mom said Violet was physically fine, but had left the house this morning without telling anyone where she was going. And given everything with Jurich being out on parole, they were terrified something had happened to her. She wasn't answering her phone, and they had been calling for 2 hours. I felt sick because I knew exactly where Violet was. She was already at the courthouse waiting for me. And now our parents were losing their minds thinking Derek had taken her. I told my mom I'd try calling Violet, too, and would let her know if I reached her, then hung up before she could ask more questions. Priya looked at me and asked what we were doing, and I said we were still going to the courthouse because Violet was clearly committed to being there, even if it meant our parents panicking. I texted Violet asking if she'd seen Mom's calls, and she responded immediately saying yes, but she'd silenced her phone because today was about me, and she wasn't going to miss it. She said she'd text Mom after the ceremony to say she'd been at a friend's house and lost track of time. I felt horrible that my wedding was causing this chaos, but we were already 3 blocks from the courthouse and Asher was waiting, and turning back now felt impossible. Priya said we could still postpone if I wanted, but I shook my head and kept walking. The courthouse was this old building with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. Asher was standing near the entrance in a dark suit I'd never seen before. And when he saw me, his whole face lit up in a way that made every complication worth it. Lucas was there with a camera ready to document everything. And Violet appeared from around a corner wearing a blue dress and the biggest smile despite the chaos she'd caused at home. She hugged me tight and whispered that she was so proud of me for going through with this. The officiant was a kind-looking woman in her 50s who guided us to a small room on the third floor where ceremonies happened. The whole space felt surreal. This tiny room with fluorescent lights where people made lifelong commitments between lunch breaks and parking ticket payments. The officiant asked if we were ready, and Asher took my hand. And suddenly, we were saying vows we'd written on notebook paper at 2 in the morning. Asher promised to support my dreams, even when they meant years of medical school stress and sleepless residency shifts. He promised to be patient with my complicated family and to never make me choose between him and them if it could be avoided. I promised to trust him completely and to never let my parents' fears make me doubt what we'd built together. I promised to actually communicate instead of hiding when things got hard because we were done with secrets after today. The officiant pronounced us married, and Asher kissed me while Violet and Priya and Lucas cheered in this quiet, respectful courthouse way. Lucas took photos of us, signing the marriage certificate, and suddenly it was legal and real, and there was no taking it back. I was married at 22 to someone my parents didn't even know I was dating. And in a few hours I'd have to tell them and face whatever came next. We went to a small Italian restaurant nearby for a celebration lunch. Just the five of us in a corner booth eating pasta and toasting with water glasses since none of us were old enough to order wine legally. Violet's phone kept buzzing with calls from our parents. And finally, she excused herself to call Mom back and deliver her prepared lie about being at a friend's house working on a project. I could hear her voice from across the restaurant, apologetic but firm. And when she came back, she said Mom was angry but relieved she was safe. She'd promised to be home in an hour, which meant our wedding lunch had a time limit. We ate quickly and took more photos outside the restaurant, trying to capture this strange, wonderful, terrifying day. Asher held me close and asked if I was okay, and honestly, I didn't know. I was happy and married, and also completely panicked about what would happen when I told my parents. Violet pulled me aside before we left and told me I didn't have to tell them today, if I wasn't ready. She said I could wait a week or a month until things calmed down with Derek's parole situation. But I shook my head and said doing this in secret for one more day felt impossible now that it was real. I wanted to be able to call Ash or my husband instead of my study partner. I wanted to wear my ring where people could see it. I was done hiding even if the consequences were severe. Violet hugged me and said she'd be there when I told them that she'd try to run interference and explain why this was different from her situation with Derek. She'd help them understand that Asher had been thoroughly vetted by her over 2 years. That she'd watched our relationship carefully for any red flags and found none. I thanked her and watched her walk toward the bus stop, the sister who'd survived hell and was still fighting to protect my happiness. Priya went back to campus and Asher and I went to his apartment where we sat on the couch in stunned silence, holding hands and staring at our matching rings. We were married, actually legally married. The enormity of it hit me all at once, and I started crying, not from sadness, but from overwhelming everything. Asher pulled me close and said we were going to be okay no matter how my parents reacted, that we'd figure it out together like we'd figured out everything else. I wanted to believe him, but I also knew my parents' financial support wasn't just tuition money. It was housing over summer breaks, health insurance, a safety net if anything went wrong. Losing that felt terrifying, especially with medical school applications coming up next year. I asked Asher if he ever regretted choosing someone with such complicated family baggage, and he said never, that my family's trauma didn't define our relationship, and he'd known what he was signing up for. I decided to tell my parents that evening, getting it over with quickly, like ripping off a bandage. I called my mom at 6 o'clock and asked if I could come over to talk about something important. She immediately asked if I was pregnant or in trouble, and I said no, nothing like that, just something I needed to discuss in person. She said my dad would be home by 7 o'clock and I should come for dinner. I met Asher at his car, and we drove to my parents' house together in silence, both of us preparing for the worst. I told him to wait in the car while I broke the news, but he insisted on coming in with me. He said we were married now, and that meant facing things together, not me protecting him from consequences. We pulled up to my childhood home and sat in the driveway for 5 minutes gathering courage before finally walking to the front door. My mom opened it before I could knock, and her face lit up seeing me before falling when she noticed Asher behind me. She asked who he was, and I said he was my study partner from school who'd driven me here because my car was having issues. Another lie, but my last one because in about 10 minutes everything would be true. We went inside, and my dad was setting the table, and he looked up and did the same double take seeing Asher. My parents had literally never met him despite 2 years of relationship because our cover story only worked if they never saw us together. Violet was already there sitting at the counter, and she gave me an encouraging nod. My mom asked if Asher wanted to stay for dinner, and I said actually yes, he should stay because I needed to tell them something and he was involved. We all sat down at the dining room table with this lasagna my mom had made, and the normally of the scene felt bizarre given what I was about to say. My dad asked how school was going, and I said fine, then took a deep breath and told him I needed to confess something I'd been hiding. My mom's face immediately tensed, and she glanced at Violet like she thought this was about Derek somehow. I said it wasn't about Violet or Derek or anything dangerous, but they weren't going to be happy about it. I pulled a chain out from under my shirt and showed them the ring I'd been hiding for 6 months. And both my parents stared at it, without comprehension. I said Asher and I had been dating for 2.5 years, that we'd met before they implemented the no dating rule, and had continued seeing each other in secret because I couldn't give up either him or their support for medical school. The silence that followed was suffocating. My dad asked if I was joking, and I said no, completely serious. My mom looked at Asher like he was a stranger who'd broken into her house, which I guess in her mind he kind of was. She asked how I could be so selfish and reckless after everything they'd been through with Violet. And I felt my face get hot with shame and anger. I said I understood their fear, but Asher wasn't Eric, that lumping all men together because of one terrible person was unfair and unhealthy. Violet spoke up and said she'd known about the relationship for 2 years and had been watching carefully for any warning signs. That Asher had treated me with nothing but respect and kindness the entire time. My dad stood up from the table, so fast his chair nearly tipped over. He said I'd betrayed their trust and broken the one rule they'd established to keep me safe, and there would be consequences. I said I knew about the consequences, but I needed them to understand something first. I pulled out my phone and showed them photos from the past 2 years. Asher and me studying at coffee shops. Him helping me move into my dorm. Us volunteering together at the free clinic downtown. Violet had secretly taken some of them, documenting a relationship my parents never knew existed. I showed them texts from Asher checking on me during midterms, bringing me food when I was too stressed to eat, staying up late to help me study for the MCAT. I showed them the spreadsheet he'd made calculating how we'd survive if they cut me off financially. My mom was crying now, and I couldn't tell if it was from anger or something else. Then I said the thing that would change everything. I told them Asher and I got married this morning at the courthouse. That Violet had been there as our witness, and that I understood if they never wanted to speak to me again, but I wasn't going to apologize for choosing happiness. The explosion I expected didn't come immediately. Instead, my dad sat back down heavily and put his head in his hand. My mom stared at the table and didn't say anything for at least 3 full minutes. Violet reached across and squeezed my hand under the table. Finally, my dad looked up and asked Asher directly if he understood what he'd signed up for. Marrying into a family this broken and complicated. Asher met his eyes and said yes. He understood completely that he'd watched me support Violet through her recovery and deal with the trauma aftermath. And he respected how much I loved my family despite the difficult circumstances. He said he didn't want to take me away from them. He wanted to be part of helping us all heal. My mom asked why we couldn't have waited 3 more years like they'd asked. And I said because 3 years was arbitrary and based on fear rather than actual assessment of Asher's character. Violet told them the story of her brain tumor and the promise she'd made me make about not wasting life waiting for perfect circumstances that might never come. She said, watching Derek nearly destroy her had taught her that life was too short and too unpredictable to postpone happiness. And she'd encouraged me to marry Asher now instead of hiding for 3 more years. My mom started crying harder, and I realized she wasn't angry anymore, just overwhelmed and scared and grieving the loss of control over a situation she'd tried to prevent. My dad asked what we expected from them now, if we thought they'd just accept this and keep paying for medical school like nothing had changed. I said, honestly, I didn't know what to expect, but I hoped they could at least try to get to know Asher before deciding he was dangerous just because he existed. We sat there for another hour talking through everything, and slowly the conversation shifted from accusations to questions. My parents asked Asher about his job, his family, his plans for the future. They asked how we'd managed to hide a relationship for 2.5 years, and I explained the study partner cover and Priya's constant alibis. They asked if Asher had ever pressured me into anything or shown signs of controlling behavior. And both Violet and I said absolutely not. That if anything, I'd been the one pushing to move faster while Asher wanted to wait and do things right. My mom asked to see the wedding photos, and Lucas had already sent them to my phone. She looked at pictures of me in my cream dress, signing the marriage certificate, and fresh tears started falling. She said I looked happy, which was apparently both wonderful and heartbreaking for her. By the time we left that night, nothing was resolved, but at least we were still speaking. My dad said he wasn't ready to give his blessing, but he wouldn't cut me off completely, that we'd figure out the financial stuff over time. My mom hugged me goodbye and whispered that she was trying to understand, and I whispered back that I knew this was hard and I was sorry for the secrecy. Asher shook both their hands and promised to take care of me, which felt weirdly traditional given the circumstances. We drove back to his apartment in silence, both of us emotionally exhausted from the confrontation. That night, lying in bed next to my husband, I felt this strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief that the secret was finally out. Guilt that telling the truth had hurt my parents so deeply. The next few months were complicated and messy. My parents agreed to meet with Asher and me once a week for dinner, getting to know him slowly and learning to trust him. Violet became our biggest advocate, constantly pointing out the differences between Asher's respectful behavior and Derek's controlling manipulation. My mom started therapy to process her trauma from Violet's relationship, and she admitted one night that she'd been trying to prevent the wrong thing. She couldn't prevent me from getting hurt, only from living. My dad took longer to come around, but gradually I'd catch him laughing at Asher's jokes or asking his advice about tech problems at work. 6 months after the courthouse ceremony, we had a small reception in my parents' backyard with extended family who hadn't even known I was dating anyone. My mom cried through the whole thing, but this time, they were happy tears. Medical school applications happened that fall, and Asher sat with me through every essay and interview prep session. I got accepted to 3 programs, and we chose the one closest to both our families because maintaining those relationships mattered to both of us. My parents helped with tuition like they'd promised. And my dad admitted he was impressed with how seriously Asher took his commitment to supporting my career. Violet started dating again for the first time since Derek, someone kind and patient who understood her trauma and never pushed her boundaries. She said watching my relationship with Asher had given her hope that healthy love existed, that not everyone would hurt her the way Derek had. Derek violated his parole 8 months after getting out and went back to prison for another 5 years, which gave all of us some breathing room. Looking back now, I don't regret getting married at 22 despite my parents' rule. Was it harder than waiting would have been? Absolutely. Did it cause pain and conflict that might have been avoided? Definitely. But it also forced necessary conversations about fear and control and healing that our family needed to have anyway. My parents' blanket ban on dating hadn't actually kept me safe. It had just taught me to hide and lie, which is arguably more dangerous than being open about relationships where warning signs could be spotted early. Violet says my rebellion gave her permission to start living again instead of letting Derek's abuse define her forever. She's planning her own wedding now to her kind, patient boyfriend, and my parents are genuinely happy for her instead of terrified. The week of our first anniversary, Asher surprised me with a proper honeymoon since we'd skipped it the first time around. We went to this small beach town where we could finally be publicly married without worrying about who might see us. We walked on the beach, wearing our rings in full view, and the freedom of it felt incredible. After years of hiding, my parents sent us a card congratulating us on 1 year of marriage, which felt like final acceptance after all the struggle. My mom had written inside that she was proud of me for fighting for my happiness, even when it scared her, and that she was grateful I'd found someone who treated me with the respect I deserved. My dad had added that Asher had proven himself to be exactly the kind of partner they'd hoped I'd find someday, just sooner than they'd expected. Telling this story now feels surreal because I remember so clearly how terrified I was the morning of the wedding, how convinced I was that my parents would never forgive me. The reality ended up being more complicated than I'd imagined, but also more hopeful. They didn't forgive me immediately, but they also didn't abandon me. They struggled and asked questions and slowly learned to trust again. Violet's recovery played a huge role because watching her heal while Derek rotted in prison proved that trauma doesn't have to define you forever. My parents had been so focused on preventing future pain that they had forgotten people also need permission to pursue joy. Getting married at 22 wasn't reckless or selfish like my dad first claimed. It was just choosing to start my life instead of waiting for someone else's timeline to allow it. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.